Imagine waking up after a year and discovering your entire kingdom has changed hands, your enemies are in power, and everyone around you is staring like they've seen a ghost, except you have no memory of where that year went or what happened while you were gone. This is exactly what happened to Henry VI of England in 1454, but the story of how he got there reveals something far stranger than simple sleep. It shows what happens when a medieval king's mind completely shuts down while his body keeps breathing, and his court has to pretend everything is normal while carrying him around like a living mannequin. Henry became king at 9 months old when his father, the legendary warrior Henry V, died unexpectedly in 1422, leaving behind an infant and 2 kingdoms that required constant military strength to hold together. The boy was raised by advisors and bishops who made him deeply religious and gentle, exactly the wrong personality for ruling in the brutal world of 15th century monarchy where weakness invited attack and hesitation meant losing everything. By the time Henry reached adulthood, everyone could see he was incapable of the job. He fainted at executions, wept over battlefield casualties, and spent royal funds building colleges and chapels while his nobles fought vicious power struggles and his armies lost battle after battle in France. The vast French territories his father had conquered were slipping away piece by piece because Henry preferred negotiating peace treaties to defending English claims with military force, and by 1453 the situation had become catastrophic. In July of that year, English forces were crushed at the Battle of Catatonia, the final devastating defeat that ended over a century of English territorial ambitions in France and reduced everything Henry's father had won to just the single port of Calais. The humiliation was complete and immediate. Every town and castle that English soldiers had died defending was lost, and the nobility blamed Henry entirely because his years of diplomatic concessions had achieved nothing except demonstrating fatal weakness. At the same time, his wife Margaret of Anjou was heavily pregnant with their first child after 8 years of marriage, which added enormous pressure to a king already overwhelmed by political crisis and national disaster. Then in August 1453, something inside Henry's mind simply shattered. Courtiers at Windsor Castle found him sitting motionless in a chair, staring at nothing, completely unresponsive when they spoke his name or touched his shoulder. At first they assumed he was deep in prayer. Henry often spent hours in religious contemplation, but when they realized he had been in the same position far too long without normal movement, they understood something catastrophic had occurred. The king had stopped being a person. His eyes were open but saw nothing, his breathing continued normally, his heart kept beating, but there was no awareness behind those eyes, no recognition when people entered the room, no response to any attempt at communication. Physicians who examined him found nothing physically wrong, no fever or signs of stroke, no injury or poison. His body functioned perfectly in every measurable way except the consciousness that should have inhabited it had simply vanished. The court moved immediately to contain the crisis because a king who could not speak or make decisions was effectively no king at all, and if word spread that Henry had collapsed into this state the kingdom would descend into immediate chaos. His advisors began issuing orders in his name while keeping him in restricted chambers, hoping desperately that he might recover in a few days. But days became weeks and then months with absolutely no change. Henry had to be dressed each morning by servants, fed by hand because he would not reach for food himself, carried from bed to chair because he would not walk, and through everything he remained completely blank, sitting or lying wherever they placed him with open eyes that focused on nothing. Contemporary chronicles recorded the constant involuntary flatulence his body produced, a crude detail that made the situation even more grotesque for everyone forced to attend the silent king, and it became clear very quickly that whatever had broken inside Henry's mind showed no signs of healing. As autumn arrived and Henry remained in his paralyzed state, servants developed a grim routine of moving him from room to room, positioning him in chairs during council meetings as though he were simply unwell, combing his hair and adjusting his robes to maintain some appearance of royal dignity while his body continued its basic functions without any conscious control. They brought him to chapel where priests conducted mass before a king who gave no sign of hearing the prayers. They carried him to different chambers throughout the day to vary his position, and they maintained meticulous care of his physical needs while the person who should have inhabited that body remained completely absent. The question that haunted everyone was whether Henry was trapped inside himself, aware but unable to respond, or whether his consciousness had simply ceased to exist, leaving behind only the biological machinery of breathing and heartbeat. In October, Margaret gave birth to their son Edward, and the child should have been cause for celebration, the long-awaited heir who secured the Lancastrian succession. But when servants brought the infant to Henry and placed him in the king's arms, hoping the sight might shock him back to awareness, Henry showed absolutely no reaction. He did not look down at the baby, did not smile or move, gave no acknowledgement that anything had changed, and that moment of non-response created a political disaster because it allowed his enemies to question whether the child was legitimate. Whispers spread immediately that perhaps Margaret had taken a lover during her husband's incapacity, with suspicion falling on Edmund Beaufort, Duke of Somerset, who had the closest relationship with the Queen and who controlled much of the royal household, and though no real evidence of adultery existed, the rumors would follow young Edward for his entire life. Margaret tried to claim regency powers, arguing that as queen and mother of the heir she should govern until Henry recovered, but the council rejected her petition almost immediately. The English nobility had never accepted her, blaming the French-born queen for the disastrous policies that led to losing France, and the idea of a woman ruling the kingdom was simply unacceptable in 15th-century politics. Instead, the council turned to Richard, Duke of York, who had been demanding a role in government for years and who arrived in London with armed supporters to make his claim impossible to ignore. York had his own Plantagenet bloodline that could potentially justify a claim to the throne, and he blamed Somerset and Margaret's faction for the military disasters in France and the corruption that had emptied the royal treasury. So when he was named protector of the realm in March 1454, one of his first acts was arresting Somerset and sending him to the Tower of London, removing Margaret's most powerful ally and isolating her from any real power. The bizarre performance continued through the winter months, Henry being displayed at formal occasions to maintain the fiction that he remained king even though everyone understood the truth. York and his supporters made decisions in council chambers while the silent king sat positioned nearby. Servants maintained careful attention to his physical appearance so he looked presentable rather than like the living corpse he had become, and priests continued offering prayers for his recovery that produced no results whatsoever. York used his time as protector to place his own allies in positions of power and attempt reforms of the corrupt administration, and for several months England achieved a strange stability despite having a king who existed only as a breathing body without awareness. Margaret watched these changes with growing fury, gathering support among nobles who feared York's ambitions and who remained loyal to the Lancastrian cause, waiting for any opportunity to restore her faction and protect her son's inheritance from the Yorkist family that might try to claim it for themselves. Then on Christmas Day 1454, after 17 months of total unresponsiveness, Henry VI suddenly woke up. There was no gradual improvement or slow recovery. He simply opened his mouth and asked where he was, as confused by the intense reactions around him as everyone else was shocked by his sudden return to consciousness. Courtiers who witnessed the moment described people falling to their knees in relief and terror, some weeping, others rushing to inform the Queen and Council, while Henry looked around with apparent bewilderment, asking questions that revealed he had no memory of the past year and a half. He did not understand why people were reacting with such emotion, had no awareness that time had passed or that anything unusual had happened to him, and when they explained he had been gravely ill, he accepted this calmly without asking for details about what that illness had involved or how long it had lasted. When they brought his son Edward to him, now over a year old, Henry received the child with joy and immediately blessed him as his legitimate heir, apparently unaware that this simple act of acknowledgement was transforming the entire political situation. During his absence, the rumors about Edward's parentage had spread throughout the court. Powerful nobles had positioned themselves based on assumptions that Henry might never recover, and York had built a government structure that excluded Margaret's faction completely. With one sentence blessing his son, Henry destroyed months of whispered speculation and restored legitimacy to the Lancastrian succession, and his sudden consciousness meant that York's protectorate, which depended entirely on the king's incapacity, had just become constitutionally irrelevant. Margaret moved immediately to exploit her husband's recovery. She convinced Henry that York and his supporters had usurped power illegally during his illness and that Somerset had been unjustly imprisoned, and Henry, who remembered nothing of the circumstances and who had always preferred forgiveness to conflict, agreed without hesitation. Within weeks Somerset was released from the Tower and restored to his position at court. York was dismissed from the Protectorate and sent away from London, and Margaret's faction reclaimed control of the government with a speed that demonstrated how completely medieval politics depended on the king's personal presence regardless of his actual competence. With Henry conscious and capable of speaking, even if what he said was politically naive, his authority was absolute, and anyone who had governed during his absence became irrelevant the moment he woke up. But Henry returned to a kingdom fundamentally transformed by his absence. France was completely lost. The humiliation of Castillon had destroyed English continental ambitions permanently. His nobles were divided into hostile factions that had spent the past year consolidating power and building military alliances, and most critically, Henry himself had been revealed as frighteningly fragile. Everyone now knew that the king's mind could simply break under pressure, that he might collapse again at any moment, and that vulnerability terrified nobles who depended on stable monarchy for their own positions and wealth. Henry went back to his gentle governing style as though nothing had changed, trying to mediate between hostile factions and please everyone while satisfying no one, making concessions to buy temporary peace while the underlying conflicts continued building toward inevitable explosion. York withdrew to his estates in fury, convinced now that Henry was fundamentally incapable of ruling and that Somerset's faction would destroy England if left in power. He began gathering military support and making serious calculations about whether his Plantagenet bloodline might justify claiming the throne directly, especially given the persistent rumors about young Edward's legitimacy. Margaret became even more aggressive in protecting her son's inheritance, seeing York not as a nobleman with legitimate grievances but as a traitor who had exploited her husband's illness to seize power, and she built alliances with nobles who would help her eliminate the Yorkist threat permanently. Henry, caught between these hostile forces and constitutionally unable to understand why people could not simply forgive each other, made decisions that alienated both sides, his recovered consciousness bringing him back to awareness just in time to preside over his kingdom's collapse into civil war. In May 1455, just 16 months after Henry woke from his long sleep, Richard Duke of York marched on London with an army, and the uneasy peace shattered into open warfare that would become known as the Wars of the Roses. York claimed he was rescuing the king from evil counselors, the standard justification for rebellion that allowed nobles to attack royal advisors while maintaining fiction of loyalty to the crown, and at the town of St. Albans his forces met the royal army in the first pitched battle of the Civil War. The fighting lasted barely an hour before York's men broke through the defenses and killed Somerset in the streets along with several other leading Lancastrians, and during the chaos Henry himself was struck in the neck by an arrow, not a fatal wound but enough to draw royal blood and force him to take shelter in a tanner's cottage while the battle concluded around him. York found Henry there after the fighting ended and immediately knelt before him, declaring his loyalty and insisting the violence had been necessary to remove traitors who were misleading the king. Henry, who had just watched his chief advisor killed and taken an arrow wound himself, accepted York's explanations without question and pardoned everyone involved in the attack, demonstrating once again his complete inability to understand political reality or protect his own interests. This pattern would repeat itself throughout the following years, Henry trying desperately to make peace between factions that wanted each other dead, giving away titles and lands to buy temporary truces that only made him weaker, unable to comprehend that the conflict had moved beyond anything his gentle negotiations could resolve. The war continued sporadically over the next several years, periods of uneasy peace alternating with sudden outbreaks of violence as both sides maneuvered for advantage. Henry remained king but his authority meant less with each passing month. The nobility had seen him collapse into unconsciousness for over a year and then wake up with no memory of what happened, They knew he was weak both politically and mentally, and powerful families began making calculations about which faction would ultimately win and whether the Lancastrian dynasty could survive at all. Margaret became the real force behind the Lancastrian cause, gathering armies and making strategic decisions while Henry remained a figurehead, his presence necessary for legitimacy but his actual input increasingly irrelevant to the people fighting in his name. In 1460, York was killed at the Battle of Wakefield, but his death only intensified the conflict because his son Edward took up the cause with even more determination and military skill than his father had possessed. In early 1461, after a series of brutal battles that killed thousands, Edward of York defeated the Lancastrian forces so completely that he was able to march into London and declare himself King Edward IV, formally deposing Henry and ending 39 years of Lancastrian rule. Henry fled north with Margaret and their son, trying to gather support for a counterattack, but the situation had become hopeless. Many nobles who had supported him during his reign abandoned the cause once the Lancastrians lost military supremacy, and for the next several years Henry lived as a fugitive in his own kingdom, occasionally leading failed rebellions but mostly just trying to survive while his wife fought desperately to restore their son's birthright. In 1465, Henry was captured in northern England, betrayed by someone who recognized him despite his attempts at disguise, and Edward IV had him brought to London and imprisoned in the Tower. He spent 5 years in comfortable but secure confinement, reading religious texts and spending his days in prayer, the gentle scholarly activities he had always preferred over the brutal business of ruling, and there must have been some bitter irony in the fact that imprisonment freed him from the responsibilities he had never wanted in the first place. For a brief moment in 1470, his supporters managed to restore him to the throne through a temporary alliance with nobles who had turned against Edward, and Henry found himself king again, confused by the rapid changes and apparently unclear on how exactly he had regained power or what was expected of him. The restoration lasted only 6 months before Edward returned from exile with an army and crushed the Lancastrian forces at the Battle of Tewkesbury in May 1471. During that battle, Henry's son Edward of Lancaster was killed, ending the direct Lancastrian line and destroying any remaining hope that the dynasty might survive. The young man who had been born just before Henry's collapse, whose legitimacy had been questioned because his father showed no recognition when presented with him as an infant, died at 17 in the chaos his father's weakness had helped create, and with his death the cause that Margaret had fought for so desperately became meaningless. Henry was brought back to the Tower after Tewkesbury, and on the night of May 21, 1471, he died. The official record claimed he perished from melancholy upon hearing news of his son's death, but everyone understood what that meant. Edward IV had ordered his murder because a living Lancastrian king, even one as broken and helpless as Henry had become, remained a potential symbol for future rebellions. The man who had spent 17 months as a living corpse, who had recovered only to watch his kingdom destroy itself in civil war, who had never possessed the strength or ruthlessness his position demanded, died alone in a tower cell, killed by the political forces his own inadequacy had helped unleash. Margaret lived another 11 years, dying in poverty in France, her entire life's work destroyed, her son dead, her husband murdered, everything she had fought for reduced to nothing. The Yorkist dynasty that replaced the Lancastrians would itself collapse within 15 years, overthrown by the Tudors who built their legitimacy partly through marriage to Lancastrian heirs and partly by simply erasing the memory of the chaotic decades that preceded them. Henry VI became a footnote in that sanitized history, remembered mostly for his bizarre year-long catatonia, the weak king who fell asleep and woke to find his kingdom changed, whose gentle nature and religious devotion made him fundamentally unsuited for medieval monarchy, and whose collapse triggered a civil war that killed tens of thousands and destroyed the dynasty his father had built. The question of what exactly happened during those 17 months when he sat blank and unresponsive remains unanswered. Medieval medicine could not explain it and modern historians can only speculate, but the consequences of that mysterious absence shaped English history for generations and demonstrated with brutal clarity that in the world of 15th-century politics, Weakness was not just a disadvantage, it was a death sentence.